In this video, we are going to be looking at how monetary and fiscal policy affect exchange rates and how all of this put together, what effect that's going to have on aggregate demand. So we're going to start with monetary policy. All right. So as we discussed in the video on what determines the exchange rate in the short run, expansionary, that's not how you spell expansionary, expansionary monetary policy depreciates currency. All right, why does expansionary monetary policy depreciate currency? All right, well, when we have expansionary monetary policy, right, we are increasing the money supply. When we increase the money supply, that's shifting that supply curve for our currency to the right, and that's leading to a decrease in the value. Right, there's more of it going around. The value is going to decrease. All right, so when this happens, right, so all right, the depreciation of a nation's currency makes their exports cheaper in the short run. Right? So if, it's again because we have these sticky prices, so when the value of a currency decreases, right, then well, let's say kind of the point here is, you're seeing an increase in the quantity demanded for exports because, again, if I used to could get $1 per euro, right, and then the dollar depreciates, right. And I can now get $1.50 per euro, right? That makes all American goods cheaper for me, right? And so with my €1, right, what I used to could buy, I used to could only buy $1 worth of goods. Now I can buy $1.50's worth of goods, right? And you put that on a larger scale, all right, and you're going to see an increase in the demand for a nation's exports. This is one of the reasons why people often talk about or complain about China depressing the value of their currency, right, is this reason right here, right? By depressing the value of depreciating their currency, they can make their exports more attractive, right? But so we see that we've got these exports kind of being cheaper, or in the long run, that's going to increase the amount of exports that are bought, right? So higher demand for exports increases net exports, right? So our net exports minus imports, part of our GDP calculation when we're using the, well, I should be able to pull that off the top of my head. The national spending approach, there we go, finally remembered. So the national spending approach to GDP, right, the net exports is a part of that. And as we know that kind of if the net exports are increasing, then so is the net export spending growth rate, right? We know that if this increases, then the velocity of money growth rate is going to increase, right? And so that the aggregate demand is going to increase. All right, so and if that's how we're going to get there. But now let's quickly just visualize this. This is just going to be our usual aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. All right, we're going to have our long run aggregate supply. We're going to have our original aggregate demand. And we're going to have a original short run aggregate supply curve. All right. All right, so when we have this kind of expansionary monetary policy, all right, we're going to see, again, our net exports growth rate increasing, which will ultimately lead to the aggregate demand curve increasing. All right, so in the short run, again, this isn't really anything new, but in the short run, we're going to get, ooh, that curved off there quite a bit. We're going to get a new short run equilibrium, right, where our new aggregate demand curve intersects with our short run aggregate supply curve. So in the short run, we get that boost to GDP through the increase in demand for exports. Right, but as we know, this usually does not last. Right, eventually people are going to adjust to this. Right, kind of getting back to that and that idea of that real exchange rate. Right, adjusting to these new changes. Right, and we're going to get a new short-run aggregate supply curve, which is going to take us back to our solo growth rate and give us just even more higher amounts of inflation, right? All right, in the long run, of course. All right, and so at this point, right, just right, just a good time to remember that money is neutral in the long run. Right, so even when you're talking about these kind of currency manipulations, right? Well, really, we already talked about how monetary policy is going to affect these things, right? One thing I failed to mention is that this shift in aggregate demand, of course, the initial expansionary monetary policy, that increase in the money supply, that is also going to increase aggregate demand. There's just going to be an additional boost, right? But due to those the increase in net exports spending rate. So it's not all coming from that net exports spending rates increase. Some of it is also coming from probably, well, it depends on a lot of things. But that increase in the money supply is also causing it. All right, but that's kind of how our fiscal our monetary policy interacts with our exchange rates and with our aggregate demand. All right, now let's turn our attention to fiscal policy. All right, so expansionary fiscal policy increases the demand for loanable funds. All right, so we discussed this, right, when we were looking at the chapter. Actually, we might have, maybe we didn't. Yeah, we should have. All right, when we were going over fiscal policy. All right, we also mentioned something similar in another chapter, but regardless, all right. So when we have expansionary fiscal policy, all right, this increases the demand for loanable funds, all right, because people are competing for those funds. The government enters, especially if they're doing an increase in government spending, and that's the way that they are using expansionary fiscal policy, right? They are going to be the borrowers competing with other borrowers, right? And so that's going to push interest rates up. Right, so interest rates, those are that's the price of a loan, right? And so the more people wanting a loan, the higher price that you can charge, right? And this higher interest attracts more foreign investment. Right? You get a higher interest rate, then somebody's going to say, hey, I can earn more money over here in this foreign market, do some foreign investing, and I can make more money than I can at home. Right. So we also know that with greater amounts of foreign investment, that we are going to see an increase in the demand for the domestic currency. Right. Then as the dollar appreciates, exports become more expensive. So the opposite of kind of the what we had going on when we were talking about monetary policy, right? So when the dollar appreciates, when it gains value in relation to those other currencies, right, then it becomes more expensive for foreigners to import American goods, right? And so we're going to see a decrease in net exports. All right, so this is another limitation of fiscal policy, right? When we have this increase in government spending, right, it can be offset by a greater difficulty trying to export goods. Right? So, the government tries to increase aggregate demand by conducting some expansionary policy, right? But because of all of these different things, right? But because expansionary fiscal policy increases the demand for loanable funds, which makes the country a more attractive opportunity for foreign investors. This increases the demand for that currency, right? And then that makes our exports more expensive, and so people buy less of them, right? And so you're going to boost aggregate demand with this extra government spending, right? But some of that is going to be offset by this decrease in net exports, right? Because it's now more expensive, right, to import American goods. All right, so that is it for this video. All right, so the bottom line here, as is often the case when talking about monetary and fiscal policy, is that it's difficult to do it right. Fiscal policy, very difficult because when you are in a world market and a worldwide global economy, right, this kind of stuff can happen, which is going to further limit the effectiveness of fiscal policy. And as the book explains, this is one of the reasons why monetary policy has become a bigger focus rather than fiscal policy, right? But even with fiscal policy, or even with monetary policy, right, we can really we're only making gains in the short term, the short run, and as far as GDP growth is concerned, and the consequences are going to be higher inflation rates. All right, but that is it for this video. In the next one, we're going to, which probably is not going to be a terribly long one, we'll talk about the difference between fixed and floating exchange rates. I'll see you guys then.